Merci beaucoup. Si vous êtes prêts, nous allons décoller tout de suite pour le prochain voyage. Restez assis, les ceintures attachées. Relaxez-vous, buvez beaucoup d'eau. Nous aurons tout à l'heure, quand tout sera calme, l'occasion de discuter. Vous savez, l'agenda est fait de sorte que le samedi après-midi, tous les participants ont un temps libre pour toute l'après-midi. Les partenaires, vous avez toute la matinée du samedi et de l'après-midi. Et vous avez aussi le dimanche, toute la matinée. Parce que dimanche, nous sommes là jusqu'au déjeuner. Donc, on va quitter ensemble pour ceux qui rentrent à Dakar pour la conférence de l'ITIE. Pour ceux qui prennent leur vol, ce sera à partir de dimanche aussi. Donc, on aura largement le temps pour pouvoir échanger, renforcer le réseautage et tisser des relations aussi. C'est ça l'occasion et l'opportunité que cette conférence Afrique nous donne. Et pendant les pauses aussi. Mais à la fin de la journée aussi, vous avez le temps entre 17h et toute la soirée de rencontrer ceux que vous voulez voir, d'échanger aussi. La majorité des participants logent dans ces deux hôtels-là. L'autre côté, c'est juste à la porte après, à gauche, dès que vous sortez. Donc, invitez-vous, discutez, échangez, partagez des contacts, des stratégies, et vous avez tout le temps pour le faire. Maintenant, pendant les sessions, on va juste se concentrer sur ces sessions qui ne durent pas plus d'1h30. Ensuite, toujours pour les questions logistiques, ceux qui ne sont pas encore enregistrés à la pause, veuillez enregistrer vos noms sur les listes à la table à l'entrée. Ça nous permettra aussi d'avoir la base de données de l'ensemble des participants qui sont là. Si vous ne trouvez pas votre nom sur les listes, écrivez le nom juste en bas de la liste et signez. Ça nous permettra aussi d'avoir vos contacts. Nous allons tout de suite passer au premier panel intitulé « Prospérité et développement durable par le biais d'une transition juste en Afrique », qui sera modéré par ma collègue Gloria Majiga Kamoto, qui est chargée de programme au Centre environnemental de plaidoyer et de politique. Ce panel nous amène jusqu'à 13h lors de la pause déjeuner. Vous aurez l'occasion, après avoir écouté ce matin la leçon inaugurale de Dr. Marie Kitao, de pouvoir aussi ramener les questions et les préoccupations que vous aviez ce matin, qu'elle pourra prendre en charge. Et enfin, pour la logistique, les délégués, notamment de publier ce que vous payez, pendant les heures de pause, il y a un bureau qui est aménagé de l'autre côté, à l'autre salle, juste à l'entrée. Vous pourrez passer voir ceux qui sont chargés des finances pour les remboursements de vos frais de dîner et certains frais qui sont identifiés dans la logistique. Ça, vous le ferez pendant la pause et dans l'après-midi. Ils sont là de façon permanente jusqu'au soir même. À la fin de la journée, ils seront sur place pour pouvoir gérer ces aspects-là. Enfin, nous avons aussi, pour ceux qui ont des soucis de santé, nous avons mobilisé 2 médecins avec la pharmacie disponible. Si vous avez des soucis de santé, parlez à l'assistance logistique, c'est-à-dire les personnes qui ont les t-shirts avec publier ce que vous payez, ils vont vous indiquer où se trouvent les 2 médecins qui pourront bien sûr vous assister si vous avez quelques soucis de santé. Si vous avez des maux de tête, il y a des médicaments. Si vous voulez des énergétiques, il y a aussi des vitamines sur place, ils pourront mettre à votre disposition. Donc, ceci dit, nous allons passer au panel suivant et je vais céder la parole à Madame Gloria Majiga Kamoto, qui va être la modératrice de cette session-là, que nous allons prendre jusqu'à la pause déjeuner à 13h. Merci beaucoup.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Oh, that is loud. Good morning, everyone. I don't see the energy. We're about to get started and I can't see the energy. I thought everybody had some coffee. Good morning, everyone. Lovely. Bonjour. I'm going to, by the time I leave this place, I'm sure I will be speaking French quite well. So you mind my broken French for now. As Demba said, thank you so much, Demba, for the introduction. My name is Gloria Majiga, and I work with Publish What You Pay Malawi. And I am privileged to be hosting what is the kickoff session this morning. As we all know, and as we've heard from the first or initiating discussions, it's going to be a big conversation around energy transitions. And so this shift from fossil fuels is becoming a huge priority for us to address in issues of climate change. However, we also must acknowledge that the energy transition must be just and equitable. And these are two words that we've heard from almost every speaker this morning, just and equitable. And another part of it is ensuring that the most vulnerable communities are not left behind. So this morning with this panel, we'll be exploring what the energy transition means for Africa. There was a question to say, what does a just and equitable transition look like? What does it mean for Africa? I'm sure for each one of us in our different contexts, we probably have our own understanding. But what my panel will be doing this morning is consolidating the different experiences that they have and trying to frame what a just and equitable transition would be like. So they're also going to be helping us navigate the idea of how we can work together to ensure that it delivers prosperity and social progress for the continent. Now, there's been a few statistics that were mentioned in the keynote address, and I'll reiterate them and perhaps introduce a few new ones. The first is that Africa is responsible for just 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet it's the most vulnerable region in the world to impacts of climate change. I'm sure we've all experienced the changing climate. For Malawi, we have definitely seen a change in the weather patterns. We've seen weather occurrences that we have never experienced before, undoubtedly attributable to climate change. And yet we are only, as Africa, a 3% contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very shocking percentage, I think, when we think about the impacts, and something for us to think about as we're talking about what a just transition means to us. According to the International Energy Agency, over 580 million Africans do not have access to electricity, and over 700 million Africans rely on traditional biomass for cooking and heating. And this takes us back to the question from the keynote address to say, why should we be talking about an energy transition when we don't even have access? The oil and gas industry accounts for around half of Africa's exports and government revenue. And the transition away from fossil fuels could result in significant economic impacts if it's not managed carefully. We've heard about stranded resources, and it's something for us to think about, that as we discuss the transition, how do we ensure that we're not left worse off? The African Development Bank also estimates that Africa needs to invest $40 to $70 billion annually in renewable energy to achieve universal access by 2030. So it takes us back to the issue of access. Once again, the cost of facilitating access for Africans while we talk about a transition. So I have this panel in front of me of very distinguished experts. And they'll be sharing their insights, as I said, and the experiences. And I'm very privileged to introduce them. So on my immediate left here is Mr. Badi Bald. Badi is the executive director of the EITI. He provides strategic oversight of implementation in all EITI member countries. He also guides EITI's policy work, including transparency in commodity trading, state-owned enterprises, artisanal and small-scale mining, and public financial management. If you could please give a round of applause to welcome Badi. Next to Badi, I think we've already met Dr. Marit Kito, who gave us a stunning keynote address. And she is the interim director of the Africa Minerals Development Center. I think we all know that by now. It's a specialized agency of the African Union. It's dedicated to implementing the Africa Mining Vision. She has extensive experience as chief technical advisor on extractives industries for sustainable development in UNDP Mozambique, and as an economist leading the minerals portfolio in UNECA and in COMESA, FDB, and US Institute of World Affairs. She is one of AMDC's founding staff, and she has contributed to major implementing tools in Africa's minerals. She received a PhD in economics from University of Nice in France and an MBA in leadership and sustainability from the University of Cambria, UK. Welcome, Dr. Mary. Next to Dr. Mary, I have Professor Tijani, who holds a PhD in nuclear physics and a PhD in polymer photochemistry. He is committed to protecting our planet, the only home that we all share. Professor Tijani launched the first master's degree in quality safety environment in Sheikh Anta Diop University of Dakar in 2003. And in 2007, to raise awareness and sensitize Senegalese and African populations on environmental issues, he launched the first West Africa's magazine dedicated to environmental issues. In 2015, he launched his Institute on Environmental and Metrology Professions. Please help me welcome Professor Tijani. And last but not least, we have Ms. Tengi George Ikoli. She is the senior officer for the Nigeria program at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI. Tengi is a lawyer, economist, and public policy expert with decades of experience in the extractive industry, dedicated to enhancing community beneficiation, transparency, accountability, and strengthened governance. She leverages advocacy, multi-stakeholder engagements, research, and analysis to strengthen NRGI's work on domestic energy transition. She represents global perspectives on the Publish What You Pay's Global Council. Tengi was not supposed to be here, so I'm sure if you're looking at the program, you're wondering who this is, and I'll allow her a few seconds to say something about that. But welcome, Tengi.
Thank you so much. I bring to you all profound apologies from Ms. Nafi Chineri. She's the Africa Director of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. Apparently, she sealed her fate yesterday at the airport while she was with Mrs. Anna Owusu Kwareng, where she was debating whether or not Eco d'Ivoire or ASCII was better. Eco d'Ivoire then canceled her flights. Mrs. Anna Owusu Kwareng, are you here? Okay, so we have the deciding votes as to what's the best. But she sends her profound apologies, and she'll be with us here tomorrow for our session being held on corruption. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let's get down to business. As we get into the discussion, I urge you all to consider what kind of engagement you want to have with the panel. We will have time for questions. If you have comments or thoughts, unfortunately, we'll not have the time today to discuss those, but they will have time to answer all of your questions and respond. So we've got the first theme, which is the need for an energy transition. Do we really need an energy transition in Africa? We're talking about 3% contribution to emissions. Is this really a conversation that we should be having? I'll start with you, Professor Tijani. Why do we need a global energy transition? And what does it mean for Africa? And while you talk about that, could you also tell us what makes the energy transition and climate change action so urgent for Africa?
C'est bon? OK. Merci beaucoup pour cette question. C'est vrai, on parle de transition énergétique pour les Africains. Mais ça concerne qui? Je pense tout à l'heure, vous l'avez dit. Ça concerne les gens qui vivent en ville. Les personnes qui vivent dans les villages, quand vous leur parlez de transition énergétique, vous leur parlez de changement climatique, elles ne comprennent pas. Nous avons fait une enquête à l'échelle du Sénégal, par exemple, pour voir quels sont les problèmes environnementaux qui intéressaient les populations. Le changement climatique vient aujourd'hui en 5e position. Aujourd'hui, les gens qui sont dans les villages, elles ont besoin de l'énergie pour faire la cuisine, pour avoir de la lumière, etc. Transition énergétique, oui. Mais je vous donne une expérience simple. Nous, dans un village, les gens allaient déféquer dans la nature. On leur a construit des latrines qu'on a couplées avec des biodigesteurs. le biodigesteur produit du gaz qui permet non seulement à ces femmes de faire la cuisine, on leur a installé des gazinières, elles ont l'énergie pour faire la cuisine, on leur a installé des lampes, elles ont la lumière. Si on était un peu plus riche, on aurait installé un alternostat qui permettrait de générer de l'énergie. Et cerise sur le gâteau, vous avez le digestat qu'on récupère du biodigesteur, qu'on a utilisé dans l'agriculture. La production de mil, on est passé de 800 kilos à 3 tonnes en une seule année. Cela veut dire quoi? On donne l'énergie aux populations, on assure la sécurité alimentaire. Et ça, c'est important. Et en plus, on préserve l'environnement. Aujourd'hui, quand on va dans le concept du One Health, aujourd'hui, il faut maîtriser l'environnement pour justement apporter un bien-être à ces populations. Maintenant, quand on parle de transition énergétique, moi, j'ai l'impression que le soleil n'existait pas en Afrique. Tiens, on dit aujourd'hui, ah, il y a du soleil, il faut passer aux énergies renouvelables, il faut passer au solaire. Si nous regardons à l'échelle africaine, combien d'équipes de recherche valables nous avons en énergie solaire? Aujourd'hui, comme je disais aux représentants allemands, il y a 2 ou 3 ans, la transition énergétique, oui, mais on ne doit pas considérer l'Afrique comme un marché. L'Afrique doit faire partie du jeu. Ça veut dire quoi? On doit, nous, être capables, par un transfert de technologie, de fabriquer des photopiles, de fabriquer des batteries, etc. Mais aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce qu'on a? On assiste à quoi? On assiste à un déversement de produits vers l'Afrique. Et tenez-vous bien, les photopiles qui arrivent en Afrique ne sont pas des photopiles qui ont une efficacité à 100%. La plupart du temps sont efficaces à 25 degrés Celsius. En Afrique, on a des températures de 35 degrés. Ne me dites pas que fabriquer une photopile, fabriquer une batterie, c'est quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Et je pense que là aussi, il faut que nos dirigeants, il faut que vous, aujourd'hui, vous poussez pour qu'on impose qu'il y ait un transfert de technologie. Parce que sans transfert de technologie, on ne peut pas lutter contre le réchauffement climatique. Et nous savons tous que la transition énergétique passe par là. Comme je le dis toujours, la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique, c'est comme un orchestre qui joue. Chacun doit jouer sa partition. Si un des membres de l'orchestre ne joue pas sa partition, la musique ne peut pas être bonne. Donc aujourd'hui, il faut qu'on transfère les technologies vers l'Afrique et l'Afrique aujourd'hui se mette à niveau en matière de recherche. On ne peut pas développer notre continent sans une recherche de qualité, sans un système éducatif de qualité. Ce n'est pas possible. On ne peut pas être toujours là à consommer ce qui vient de l'extérieur. Nous devons nous-mêmes initier sur beaucoup de questions. Aujourd'hui, vous avez, je prends les pirogues qui utilisent du gasoil. Pourquoi on ne mettrait pas sur les pirogues des photopiles solaires qui permettraient d'alimenter ces pirogues? Non seulement elles auraient l'énergie, mais ça protégerait les piroguiers, les pêcheurs qui sont sur la barque. Vous avez tellement d'idées comme ça qu'on pourrait développer en Afrique. Donc aujourd'hui, il faudrait, je pense, repenser cette transition énergétique. Et comme on l'a dit toujours, on le dit, on le répète, l'Afrique n'est pas responsable du réchauffement climatique. On ne peut pas porter le chapeau. Et quand on parle aujourd'hui de transition, on dit énergie solaire, truc, mais depuis quelque temps, on ne parle d'utilisation du gaz. Pourquoi aujourd'hui, on a décarboné le gaz? Parce qu'à cause de la crise de l'Ukraine, les Européens ont des problèmes d'approvisionnement en gaz venant de l'Ukraine. Ils se sont dit, donc, on va décarboniser le gaz pour pouvoir utiliser ce gaz pour produire de l'énergie. Et puisqu'ils étaient en partenariat avec justement les États, notamment l'État du Sénégal, ils ont décarbonisé le gaz. Aujourd'hui, vous pouvez utiliser le gaz. On considère que vous ne polluez pas l'environnement alors que c'est faux. Donc, je pense sur ces questions, il faut que l'Afrique porte sa voix. Et porter sa voix, c'est avoir des compétences. Non pas laisser nos décideurs aller tout seuls aux négociations, parce que dans la plupart du temps, excusez-moi, ils n'ont ni les compétences et ils n'ont pas l'honnêteté d'impliquer justement les chercheurs, d'impliquer les scientifiques par rapport à toutes ces questions. Donc voilà, madame, ce que j'avais à dire par rapport à cette question. Merci.
Thank you, Prof. One thing I captured was that climate change is just like a band and everyone has to play. So it seems like even though we are the least emitters, we still have a part in the band to play, or else we'll still continue to see the impacts of climate change. And while we're on that, I'll invite Dr. Mary Kitao. Can you tell us a bit more about the impacts of climate change for Africa? And how is the African Union seeing the potential risks to people, the environment, and the African economies? I think you've done quite a bit of research on what the impacts of climate change will be on other value chains. How can we link this, and how are we seeing, as African Union, the potential?
Yeah, thank you very much for this. Of course, as was mentioned, 3% only climate change, but of course we see the impact of climate change. And when we talk about transition, of course, even though we're not, as African countries, we're not the main culprits for the emissions, we have to be strategic about it. And we see it, as I mentioned, in the African Union context, we see this as a strategy, because not just because we're not the ones that are polluting, we are the ones also bearing the brunt with all these floods going on, with all these, I have some numbers here, but I don't want to bore people with numbers, but we know that the impact is here. So we are trying to position Africa in a strategic way, so that we're not left behind. We cannot just see it from, it's happening there, so we cannot be there. We want to be able to be on the table. And I would like to comment on this energy transition. I mean, I already said it in the keynote address, but I want to reemphasize, what does this energy transition mean for Africa? Again, and I'm glad the professor talked about the real politics and on the community side, how they are affected, and what does this translate for them. And we, as an apex body at the African Union, we see this as a strategic positioning of Africa, using this opportunity as an opportunity, that everyone wants to decarbonize, but for decarbonizing, they need us. I mean, we are in this very geopolitical tension, and we see it happening in real time at the African Union, because maybe the European Union has their own Critical Raw Materials Act. They want to source. China has its own Belt and Road Initiative, but it's very much critical minerals as well. The US has now the Inflation Act, but they already also have one. Korea, others are, and they are all coming to Africa to seek for so I think this is an opportunity for us. And I really want African countries to see this. For us, at least, to be at the center of the we are the ones that have the bargaining power, the highest bargaining power. But are we realizing this as African countries? And when we do that, because of our 600 million that don't have access, we have to make sure that what we get out of these materials, not raw, of course, but value addition, it goes back to the population. Again, we talked about this photovoltaic solar panels that we are buying again from other countries. Again, we are in this position of being in the other, we are just exporting finished products, importing finished product. We have to plan for this. That's why I was emphasizing that we really need to be strategic about how to do that. Of course, we have to transition, or we have to leapfrog, because from zero, you can only leapfrog. How do you transition? From zero, you can go to affordable, reliable access, renewable energy, but how do you do that? Are we again using the pattern of we are buying finished products from the solar panels, or are we producing them in-house? If we do this locally, we create jobs, we create value on the continent, and use that to, again, go back to the communities and this is how it should be. Not, we are again importing solar panels, wind turbines, although we have them in our own midst. So That's why we keep saying this is the opportunity for us to really have strategic and also have the cost benefit analysis, not only in terms of cost, again, that what is for the well-being of our population. As rightly mentioned, climate change might not be the priority of those people who are they can't have food to eat on the table. So if you tell them, then what? So the right to development is real. And I want to emphasize here about the gas situation, because this is not my position, but why they came up with the gas as a transition is not because of Ukraine, Russia. It was before then, the discussion were there before, because let's face it, in the reality, this is not my position, just to make sure that this is the position of the negotiators at the COP27 last year, is because we still need those fossil fuels for industrializing and for other, because the energy efficiency of other renewables is still not that efficient for them to really power all these industries that we need. And Africa still has some gas. And so they came up, I'm saying they, because this is not my personal opinion, that we need, because we are only 33% emissions, we still have the right to have some leeway, bridge transition to use this gas. It doesn't mean that it's clean, not at all, but it's the less polluting than oil and coal. As you know, China still uses coal. That's how they have all these manufacturing and equipment going on, because they're using coal. Nobody addresses that, because they have that's the energy that is maximum provides for now, although it's very dirty. So the point is very at the practical level, but they need phase it out, because as I said, it might be stranded. So yeah, I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much. I'll come back to that. Actually, I think you've talked quite a bit on the access point, and I think we want to hear a bit more about that. But perhaps I'll invite Tengi. Global climate action is currently too slow, right? I think we've seen that the response is just not at the pace that we would have expected. I'm getting some. Is everybody having the same problem? Are we audible? Okay. All right. So, I mean, we just haven't seen the level of response that we would expect, but of course, countries are making moves to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. So what does this mean for African countries who have seen oil and gas as a pathway to development? Dr. Marit just talked now that, we sort of have some leeway, but as the world looks at that transition, what does this mean for Africa?
Okay, thank you for that question. For Africa, obviously the shift to cleaner energies is something that's necessary to combat climate change. But as already heard today through the different conversations, there are some benefits to that process, and there are obviously some transition risks. For different African countries, there's currently a reliance in terms of development and in terms of their energy mix as well. You have a country like South Africa that relies on energy for fossil fuels for 71%, Ghana, similar. You have a Nigeria that's reliant on it for foreign exchange earnings to about 90%. You have, even at the national level, relying on it for revenues for about 50%. And then the subnational level as well, which is where you have the communities, the women, the youth as well, in terms of where they're able to get access to economic activity. You have that reliance on fossil fuel revenues, where if, for instance, we're to leapfrog, as we've heard said a couple of points, those areas and those regions will become insolvent and they're unable to function. So these are things that governments have to really consider and balance in terms of this shift to renewables. In terms of what the implications will be on their people, in terms of putting social safety nets in place that will ensure that the transition is eased for the benefit of those that are in those communities, that we find other gainful employment opportunities, that we make sure they're able to key into the value chain of renewables as well, because there will be a lot of displacement in terms of jobs, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of the well-being of those communities as well. So we need to pay attention to that. There has commission around the energy mix as well, diversifying the energy mix. We've talked a lot and heard a lot today about the 600 million people that are without energy. In Nigeria alone, you have about 45% of the population living in darkness. And so that consideration about shifting to solar, to wind, and really tapping into that value chain as well. I think that's mentioned a couple of times, but we cannot overemphasize the importance of value addition and ensuring that we retain those benefits in the country. Also, we have to look at the development of those regions to make sure that, and the involvement in the process as well, to make sure that they're meaningfully engaged in contributing their perspectives, their concerns, and are taken fully throughout the process. Because when you talk about energy transition, you're talking about someone who uses cars that's fueled by petrol and potentially moving to electric vehicles. You're talking about the woman who currently potentially cooks with charcoal and kerosene, moving to biomass and other sort of sources. So we have to be very critical about how we're making sure that that transition involves the people on the ground, and the thinking around that as well. So we're cascading our decisions from the national level and the top priority decisions to those who it actually is going to affect. Another aspect that has been considered at different points as well is just energy transition, and it means different things to different people. There's from the national perspective on looking at fairness and justice for countries that have not contributed as much, but have suffered a lot of all of the impacts. But with that also, you have to look nationally too, to make sure that you're also keying into those jobs that are potentially going to be lost, but those that would also be gained, to reskilling and upskilling as well, to make sure that people are able to tap into this new industry potentially. And then also looking at international funding. There's a lot of money that's going to be required to transition. For different countries, there are huge bills that are required to transition. For some countries, up to 1 trillion more, and others more. For this, you have to make sure that the international community is actually providing funds that are required to transition. There was a commitment for $100 million, but that has yet to be seen significantly. You've seen transition with South Africa, a commitment to 8.5 trillion. Some of that has been released, but there are always challenges within that as well. So if we have to shift it in transition, we have to realize that a significant knowledge transfer is going to be required, significant capacity building is going to be required, finance is going to be required, technology is going to be required. And a lot of these African countries are still grappling with developmental challenges, and so do not necessarily have these resources. So we have to be strategic about how we're planning for and to mitigate these other issues as well. Because again, there's no power in a lot of these communities, in these countries. There are not sufficient jobs as well. So it's balancing those and also making sure that these countries can actually transition rather than just the rhetoric, because they can even have a willingness to transition, but not have the tools that are required to do so. So there's that balance that has to be achieved as well. And then you have the development banks and different financial institutions as well that have systems that are still potentially prohibitive for African countries that actually want to access those funds. And so something has to be done to de-risk those sort of funds as well, and funding mechanisms to ensure that these countries are actually able to access these sorts of funds as well. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tengi. Quite a lot of points there on what should be done, and of course the challenges that we face. Where are we going to get the money for it? So I would like to go back to Dr. Marie. We've talked about access, and she's talking about the resources that will be needed. It seems like a very bleak picture. It doesn't look very promising. It looks like we're in quite a bit of trouble. We're in way over our heads, and I really wanted to just go back to what you talked about in terms of the issues of access and how we can benefit as Africans. So what do you think the right kind of energy transition how do you think it can unlock wider benefits for African people? You talked a bit about jobs, you talked a bit about, probably cheaper access to technologies. Can you just tell us a bit more about that, and what is the role of the AU in this, in realizing this? Because it obviously is going to need a lot of cooperation between countries, but with the idea of sovereignty, it's also very difficult to try to push this agenda, which actually requires countries to come together. So could you tell us a bit more about your strategy? It is strategic, but how do we actually get to realize this? What is the strategy for the AU, and how can we actually see this coming into play amongst the countries without compromising their sovereignty?
Yes, again, thank you very much for the question. Financing is a major issue. As you know, the Western countries promised 100 billion a year for the transition agenda, but we're not really seeing this happening. But I think we should not really rely only, of course, we have to rely on external financing, but we have to look inwards, I think, because domestic resource mobilization is our pathway. That's why I am insisting on this local beneficiation and local adding value. Because let me just take an example. There's a big example on the DRC Zambia precursor plant, and we are very proud to be part of that initiative. This is an initiative that started with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, African Development Bank, and other African institutions, Africa Legal Support Facility, BADEA, etc. What are the costs and the benefits of having a battery precursor plant in the DRC? It was a study that was commissioned to Bloomberg, and it came out clearly that it is cost and emissions effective to have a battery precursor in DRC. So battery precursor is the phase where it's no longer raw, but it goes to precursor, nickel, manganese, cobalt. It doesn't go up to the battery itself, but eventually, hopefully, we hope that happens because, China is dominating and it doesn't have cost effectiveness to have it in the whole battery in Africa yet. But why I am talking about this when we talk about financing is because we are targeting, if you are just saying with the raw material, the market you're targeting is 11 billion. It seems a lot, but it's not. Because most of it, as I mentioned, it goes anyway to illicit financial flows, it goes to transfer pricing, it gets lost. Don't want to say corruption, but I have to say it. It gets lost and doesn't come back to the people anyway, if you focus only on the revenue part of it. But if you go up to this value chain and you go up to the precursor, your market becomes 271 billion. So if that comes to the coffers then that's how you can finance these changes. That's why we are really, really thinking about domestic resource mobilization, how to be innovative, how to have that kind. And interestingly, the professor talked about research and development. That's exactly what we lack. We need throughout the whole value chain, but especially on this very specific, for instance, Advanced Battery Center of Excellence. And Lumumbashi University is now starting to have one. This is where we should go. We should have a critical mass of experts on the continent so that we don't have to look external for financing for everything. But of course, we need the skills and the technology from outside, but it needs to be in a win-win situation where there is real transfer of skills, technology, and that's how we retain the value. That's how we can get any of the for this. So that's why we think this is a way to finance our own energizing Africa. And I mentioned it in the keynote address. We can't be in a situation where we are still importing solar panels because we are back in the whole, we don't really get out of it, but we are buying, even though the costs are going down. But at the end of the day, who gets we have to be able even to manufacture the solar panels on the continent, the wind turbines. And we have, as I said, we have the resources, we have all what it takes. It's just that we need the skills and the technology. And that's when we have to have a win-win collaboration with this has to be our turn. And that's why we are positioning in the upcoming strategy that I mentioned. It's not yet out, so I can't say much about it, but the African Green Mineral Strategy, this is how we position ourselves. We are saying we have the minerals, we have to make sure that we value add, we get the local beneficiation, value addition on the continent. We need the skills and the technology for it. And of course, we have to address the environmental, social, and governance aspect of it. And for that, we have to have win-win collaboration and an African position. If we get this African strategy Of course, as you know, it's recommendations, and then but it goes through our AU committees. If it gets approved like the Africa Mining Vision, or at least we have a way of saying, okay, even though they are sovereign, but they have to, we need to be united as Africa. 55 countries is a lot, but we need to have, especially those who have significant minerals on their soil, we need to have a united position on this. And that's how we can transition, or we can leapfrog to these modern, reliable, affordable, renewable energy systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kitao. I'm looking forward to coming back to that, to hear more about the how, because I mean, it's not that we don't want to do the things, but to talk about the domestic mobilization of resources. The assumption is that there are resources domestically. So perhaps it's a case of chicken and egg to start from the discussion of EITI. And I'm sure Badi will talk a bit more about that, on how then accountability and transparency would then increase the pool of resources towards this. But to go to Professor Tijani, how can the energy transition deliver the climate action the continent needs? And how can it improve, the lives of communities? We've heard about a lot of things that have been discussed so far and the potential environmental impacts. So, I mean, we're looking at a transition, but we're also looking at potentially higher impacts, on the environment. So there needs to be a balance, and as we look into the potential for, local communities to transition, if it's transitioning at all, whether it's now just leapfrogging into access, but how do we also foresee this as an opportunity for them to combat climate change, but also how their lives can actually improve? What are some of the positive outcomes from this?
Je pense que la première chose, c'est d'abord de reconsidérer notre développement. Comme je dis toujours, l'Europe, les États-Unis ont pris une voie de développement qui nous a conduit aujourd'hui au réchauffement climatique. Est-ce que nous, Africains, on doit suivre cette même voie? Je pense qu'il faut réfléchir là-dessus. L'idée de base pour moi, c'est de réconcilier l'environnement avec l'économie. Le bien-être des populations dans les villages, dans un modèle de développement, il y a des choses, je dirais, de base. Il faut de l'énergie pour faire de la cuisine. Mais aujourd'hui, cette énergie pour faire de la cuisine, les populations sont obligées d'agresser la nature, de couper des arbres. Lorsque vous coupez des arbres, non seulement vous contribuez au réchauffement climatique, et en plus, vous détruisez la biodiversité. En quelques décennies, on a perdu 40% de notre biodiversité, avec toutes les conséquences que cela peut avoir. Vous savez qu'en Afrique, on se soigne beaucoup avec les plantes. Aujourd'hui, il faut reconsidérer ce développement. J'ai parlé tout à l'heure de biodigesteurs, qui peut être une voie. Les populations, elles ont besoin peut-être de charbon pour faire la cuisine. Ce charbon, on n'est pas obligé de le prendre dans le feu de bois. Un exemple simple, il suffit de dire aux entreprises qui produisent des déchets, des déchets en papier, quand on imprime, on a des déchets en papier, qu'est-ce qu'on en fait? On peut en faire du biocharbon, mais attention, il faudrait imposer à ces entreprises de ne plus utiliser d'encre chimique, il faut utiliser de l'encre à eau. Parce que l'encre chimique, si vous en faites du biocharbon, vous aurez des émanations qui peuvent être dangereuses pour les populations. Donc, c'est dans un premier temps, c'est-à-dire qu'il faut améliorer la situation des populations en termes de bien-être, qu'elles puissent se soigner. Et avec le biodigesteur, je maintiens qu'on peut produire de l'électricité. Je vous donne un exemple. La Socasse, là où on tue les ovins et les bovins. Il y a un ami qui a mis en place un biodigesteur géant. Ce biodigesteur géant, il n'y a pas de son, c'est bon? 1, 2, 3, c'est bon. Donc, ce biodigesteur géant, en fait, qu'est-ce qui se fait? il alimente en électricité les chambres froides. Quand vous savez qu'une chambre froide, elle pompe beaucoup d'énergie, vous avez une solution pour cela. J'avais contacté une fois notre recteur de l'université. Je dis, monsieur le recteur, à l'université de Dakar, vous avez 80 000 étudiants qui vont aux toilettes tous les jours. Ça va dans les fosses. On aurait pu produire du biogaz, alimenter les cuisines. Il y a un point avec le micro. Donc, alimenter les cuisines. Donc, il faut revoir notre mode de développement. Je ne refute pas le fait que l'Afrique doit passer à la transition énergétique. On est obligé de le faire. Mais c'est comment le faire? Je me refuse aujourd'hui à accepter qu'on me dise voilà ce qu'il faut faire, alors que ce qu'on m'impose ne répond pas justement aux besoins de nos populations. On m'impose des matériaux, on m'impose des batteries, on m'impose des centrales solaires. Aujourd'hui, on a construit des centrales solaires au Sénégal. Comme j'ai discuté avec un ministre français, qui me disait, vous allez vers le développement durable, on va vous installer une centrale solaire. Je dis, oui, monsieur le ministre, c'est bien beau, mais ce que vous faites, ce n'est pas du développement durable. J'appelle développement durable quand c'est nous, Sénégalais, qui fabriquons les photopiles, quand c'est nous, Sénégalais, qui fabriquons les batteries, quand c'est nous, Sénégalais, qui fabriquons la centrale solaire. On va fabriquer, ils vont nous mettre une centrale solaire. On ne maîtrise ni la technologie. C'est la même chose avec le TER, c'est la même chose avec le BRT. On ne maîtrise pas la technologie. Au moindre pépin, on est obligé d'attendre qu'un technicien vienne de l'extérieur pour le réparer. C'est la même chose avec les appareils de radiologie OGI. Est-ce que nous pouvons continuer à vivre dans cette dynamique? Ce que je dis, je l'ai dit à l'échelle étatique, c'est ce que nous, en tant que chercheurs, nous vivons. Moi, j'avais des appareils qui étaient tombés en panne. J'ai été obligé de les rapatrier en France pour les faire réparer. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'on peut se développer ainsi? Il faut être sérieux. Je pense qu'il faut qu'on revoie un peu notre stratégie de développement. Aujourd'hui, nous avons l'avantage, les minéraux les plus importants se retrouvent en Afrique. Quelle valeur ajoutée en avons-nous donné à ces minéraux? Je prends l'exemple du Sénégal. On a découvert le pétrole, on a du gaz. Mais 90% des Sénégalais, ils se disent on va être riche demain. Parce qu'on va commencer à exporter. Il y a Eric qui me dit de me taire. Donc, je finis Eric, après je continue. Donc, je dis aujourd'hui, on va produire du pétrole. Mais on est dans une dynamique de vendre ce pétrole. Non. Il faut transformer ce pétrole. Il faut créer des emplois. Il faut créer une valeur ajoutée. C'est ça qui fera notre développement. On ne peut pas continuer à prendre toutes nos matières premières, à les exporter sans créer justement une valeur ajoutée par rapport à cela. Je suis obligé de céder la parole parce qu'ils veulent me tuer là. Merci.
Thank you so much, Prof. A lot of great points there. I'm just thinking about the new environmental challenges that we'll have from this discussion itself. We've talked about a plant. I mean, I'm sure there was an environmental impact assessment that was done, for us to also understand the new challenges that we'll be facing in terms of pollution and impacts on the environment, on biodiversity and ecosystems. It's certainly worth considering. And as we get into the how, I think Buddy has the tedious task of, of helping us to sort of define the pathway moving forward from here. So, Buddy, from you, we wanted to understand in your experience with the EITI, but also maybe with working with countries as they try to understand the transition, how should African countries be positioning themselves to ensure that their economies can remain resilient in the face of energy transition and even thrive? I think this is a question that everybody has on their minds right now, and hopefully you can answer it for us.
That's a tough challenge. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you. Perhaps I can just start by acknowledging the fact that the conference here, it's unique timing. and we look forward to continue this conversation in our global events next week. To address your question, I would suggest I first acknowledge a very important points made here, and the advantage of going last is that I don't need to repeat them. I can just agree with them. I particularly emphasize this point of the sense of urgency that you highlighted, and the sense of coherence of policies that we have not been successful in the past. And this is a unique opportunity. We all agree on that, but there have been these opportunities in the past. How can we this time realize this potential? I think there is something unique with the energy transition specifically compared to previous boom and bust cycles. So if you think about it, in previous cycles, high demand of commodities, it was not broad-based actually across Africa. It was almost a zero-sum game. So if you're a large commodity producer, depending on whichever commodity, if you are a large producer of oil and gas, Nigeria or Angola and so on, you will see huge inflows to your foreign account, to your current account, whereas net importers that would be severely impacted by the same cycle. What is interesting about this energy transition is that one of its characteristics is we have an opportunity. Everybody has an opportunity here, whether you are a resource producer or not. There is an opportunity here to use rapidly evolving technologies to improve access to clean access to electricity, as the professor mentioned, to make sure that these technologies, the most affordable technologies, are being rolled out on the continent, and we are not necessarily wedded by all technologies that are costly, and we avoid being a dumping ground in that regard. So it has its unique opportunities there. I also want to acknowledge the point about just transition in the sense of fairness and equity. I do think that is a very important element to emphasize, especially from Africa, with all the statistics that were cited earlier. There was a big breakthrough at the COP27, as you all know, with this loss and found damage fund. But I am not hearing any campaigning about that. And that is just an opening shot. In order to realize that fund, we will need to provide serious advocacy, and many coalitions have a lot to learn from Publish Pay Coalition with your snappy lines and moving the process forward that way. So I think that is a unique opportunity there that we can take advantage of. Perhaps I will end with 3 key recommendations as a way forward. Some of them may be provocative, and please give me a bit more time to elaborate if I need to. First, we need to stop infantilizing African government. Second, we need to account for our mistakes and learn from them. And third, we need to build from our successes. So let me just go very quickly on those 3 points. What I mean by we need to stop infantilizing African government, and for African people more generally, every time we talk about governance in Africa, it's often from a supply side perspective. It's somebody's studies, it's our studies, it's an IMF report, it's a diagnosis, it's your report, it's a development partners and so on. Providing solutions to African government before they even ask for it. And I remember in working for a previous employer, meeting a government, this is a founder of development, and meeting a finance minister in a country where the request to us was, give us a consultant to read all the previous studies that all these other departments have paid before, so we figure out whether that study you are proposing now have not been paid before. It's just to give you an idea of the supply side governance that we have. We deploy consultants to draft hydrocarbon code, mining code, now all kind of legislations and regulations, but frankly, nobody's reading them. And no, sometimes I have seen mining code being adopted and revised 2 weeks later just because actually it went from straight to the consultant to the parliament and so on. So we do need to, and I think here again, the Publish to Pay Coalition has a lot to teach others in the sense that that bottom-up approach that was built early on about publish to pay, and that demanded that a form of accountability from government to citizens. We need to go back to that first order principles and apply the same for the energy transition that and emerging challenges that we are facing now. I mentioned the second point about learning from our mistakes. And I will not say too much about this, but I will give you a reference. I can't give you perhaps I can read the exact reference, so you can go on Google and find it for yourself. If you look at the SEC, this is the United States Security and Exchange Commission. They have a page, a database called SEC Enforcement Actions. It's for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act cases from 2010 to 2023. A complete database of all corruption cases where the United States government brought on charges against a company and that they settled and they pay fines and so on and so forth. You will see from country to country to country, you will see it's like right across all of African countries, from Angola to Algeria to Chad to DRC to Guinea to Ghana to Mozambique to DRC again, and DRC again in South Africa and so on and so forth. It's why I'm highlighting that webpage. It's just last month in April, they published, here's a statement that you will see, an oil service company agreed to pay approximately $8 million to resolve charges that it violated an FCPA anti-bribery and so on and so forth, with payment made by its subsidiary to an Angolan government official through a purported sale agent. This is the company agree. It would not be stated if the company did not agree to this. And we can go on and on and on that list. But why am I drawing your attention to that list? To me, what is more shocking is that there is more literature outside of Africa. There is more outrage, more enforcement actions against corruption for things that took place in Africa where African people are the victims than here in Africa. That is a problem. We have to change that dynamic. We have to take to the, and this is basic, this is not sophisticated corruption. This is bribery cases where I'm not talking about transfer pricing or convoluted systems of illicit financial outflows. This is basics, old book kind of bribery stuff. Case after case after case after case. And it is not the African government that is bringing these charges. It is not African people demanding that accountability against the people who are involved. Why is it just we have to hold those foreign government have to hold their companies accountable for crimes that took place in Africa, and the officials involved here, we don't have a mechanism to hold them to account, and we cannot learn from those mistakes. Therefore, we keep on committing the same mistakes. That has to stop. If we don't address those fundamental issues, I'm giving you this concrete example rather than talk about governance challenges in the abstract. I want to come to, because we are all campaigners, you will relate to those cases that have not been addressed in a proper manner. But lastly, we need to learn from our successes. And I think this is not flattery to Publish to Pay. I think along together with Publish to Pay, EHI, many partner organizations here and supporters and all institutions involved, we have come a long way. We have built over the last 10 years or so, actually changed the norm and the culture. Now it is accepted that transparency should be at least expected. And we actually have a lot of successes that we can learn from here. I see many colleagues here from Burkina Faso, from many other countries. I remember the first generation of EITI reports in all those countries, and we have the advantage of having 27 member countries that have been implementing the standard for more than 10 years or so. So you have a vast amount of data. And what is really interesting is the first generation of report, where it was the civil society coalition that would take the report and go to the local communities for dissemination campaigns. But the first reaction was, if the government is getting these billions on our behalf, what is there for us? And you will see from Burkina Faso to Cote d'Ivoire to DRC and so on, all the changes in mining code that happened afterwards. It was about this point about domestic resource mobilization, local sourcing, benefit to local communities. I think we did well to improve the legislations and include these clauses. Implementation is still going to take some time, but there is a foundation to build on. Maybe then lastly, is we just completed a refresh of the EITI standard, which we hope to launch now. And this is again, thanks to advocacy by all of you with your representative on our board and so on, that again, keep pushing the EITI forward and demanding that transparency and accountability covers the entire value chain, and that we are doing that in a robust manner. So one thing that I will, because I want to be with you for tomorrow and so on, I saw a session that you have tomorrow called, I think it's Publish What You Plan, which I fully endorse, and I wish I would be there. Why I'm pointing this to you, because we hope with the broad and updated standard that covers so many topics, you would be able to use the standard to develop strategies. And again, going back to avoiding a supply side transparency, that you demand what type of report based on that standard, rather than saying, let's have a brute force report that covers all these issues. What are the most important issues in these countries? Like, what are the questions we need to answer, and be more purposeful on how those reports are produced, and be coherent on how we implement the standard that way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Fadi. With COVID, I think one of the things that came out from the EITI process was the flexible reporting, which has been almost like a diagnostic tool where countries then decide what they want to report on. And I know one of the things that has been advanced from that has been potentially reporting on energy transition. So where this research that has been conducted, you can almost deep dive into it and have a better understanding. So I think the EITI itself creates a very big opportunity for us to really understand what we need in our different contexts. I'll quickly go back to Tengi. We've talked about the risks. We've talked about, how the risks of fierce competition increases, and there's a lot of things around this, but we want to hear from you on how we can make sure that these minerals contribute to sustainable development and an energy transition for Africa. I know you've done a bit of research, or a lot of research actually, but I think each of us wants to come out from this conversation with a better understanding of, when we go back to our different countries, how can we make the resources that we have work? So this is still on the pathway of how we can realize a just transition,
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. And I think a lot of the conversation today has actually brought out some of the findings that we had. NRGI has a report called the Triple Win that properly consolidates a lot of these perspectives around what it means for sustainable development with minerals. And one of the things that I think we should also bear in mind is that this is not new. Minerals has already been existing. The energy transition puts an urgency on it and potentially a different spin on it. And it then makes it more imperative for African countries to really pay attention, because there's now an agenda that focuses a lot more on those minerals, and the practices of potentially not strengthening governance and transparency, ensuring sustainable mining, puts us at larger risk if that is not focused on, and the line is not held, because there's a potential to ignore it, as some countries have done in the past, but it's imperative to make sure that that is not the case moving forward. So one of the ones that came out as well in the reports and in general has been spoken about today is around being accountable governance, ensuring that there is responsible investing as well, because potential funding also can be attracted, and all funding not necessarily is positive funding or beneficial funding. It comes with something. And so we have to be mindful in terms of how we engage and how we negotiate as countries to make sure that it guarantees long-term sustainable development. And what that means is it addresses the unique context and stories of different countries. So we're going with having a win-win, but coming from the perspective of how it's going to benefit our countries in the long term. Another thing around that is looking at environmental hazards as well. So this could also be marginally, significantly increased as you have this exploitation as well, which even contributes to the climate change as well. So it's important to have those very strict and stringent environmental certifications for the companies that are ramping up. You have a lot of explosion of Chinese as well in different countries around exploitation. So it's important to hold the line to make sure that these standards are upheld and are strictly implemented. Because another thing that we found, obviously, in Africa, the implementation can sometimes be a challenge. There are a lot of good laws and policies as well, but ensuring that implementation of those laws is something that has to be really held to a standard. And then you also have a lot of partnerships as well. Regional corporations, international corporations is also very important. You have a statistic where the DRC produced cobalt to up to 41%. But how is that actually being localized? That was mentioned already. How are you making sure that the value is being retained and also benefiting those other countries, African countries regionally as well? Because we have these energy access concerns, but we can actually have an opportunity to benefits and enhance and retain that within the region as well to address these constraints. So looking at domestic energy resources as well and transition potentially, and balancing that out with what we're looking at as from an export perspective. We also have to look at social inclusion and community engagement. That cannot be overemphasized because they tend to suffer the brunt of these impacts. So it's important to make sure that they're carried along. It's important to make sure that we are including them in the decision-making process from the bottom up. We're respecting their land rights. We're ensuring fair compensation for them as well. Ensuring that we're being mindful of the indigenous knowledge and the cultural heritage as well. It's so important. It can be so easily overlooked if we're not paying enough attention. And we have to make sure that there's also infrastructural development as well to make sure that the transportation networks, the supply chains as well within those countries, also regionally, are also emphasized as well. We have an estimated potential revenue from taxation to the tune of 475 billion coming to Africa. But for that to come, we have to have proper systems of managing the revenues that are coming into the countries from mining exploitation as well. So we have to be very mindful of those. Another last point I can see point being raised has been said already, that we have to make sure that there's environmental infrastructure around energy infrastructure as well, models and strong policies even in place. There has to be an assessment in terms of what the gaps are, because there are still some gaps that have not necessarily been plugged, to make sure that we look from end to end for the value chain, to make sure that as we're exploring these new opportunities, these previously existing opportunities, that we're making sure that we're collecting the value and ensuring the beneficiation of the local industries, the local markets, and also the people, to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're focusing on a people-centered transition, because that's what matters. Thank you.
Indeed, people-centered, that really is what matters. People should be at the center of the transition. Dr. Mary, I think you can finish off the discussion on the how. We did say we'd come back to that. You've said quite a lot, on what you are doing as the AU. I mean, it doesn't have to be a step kind of process, but we certainly would want to understand more the kind of steps that governments can take to collaborate and promote a just and sustainable energy transition across the continent. You've already spoken a bit to this, but perhaps you can just tie it in and get us thinking.
Yes, thank you. I know we have spoken too much about it, but I want to for it to be interact. I like the comment from Professor. He was saying we need to have our own development strategy, not imposed from others, but from indigenous. And Tanguy mentioned indigenous knowledge. So just to remind ourselves that, you know, we started mining a long time ago, thousands of years, and there were some value addition being made by indigenous people. The forgers, even if you look at the Benin bronze and all of these, they already knew, they had these techniques of using metals and adding value and putting them, even they had the firewood to pour at the time. And I was reading this very interesting article that, you know, apparently when there was a slave trade and even colonization, they actually used this to this kind of knowledge for their own good, and then they imported even the skills with the people, with the slavery. So I'm just saying, we are not new to value addition. It's just historically that, you know, we've been delegated to this role, relegated to this sort of raw material because of at the time, and it's good to know our history and how it's really why we are still in this position. Is because, you know, mining sector was an enclave where raw material shipped literally from pit to port and shipped out to Western countries with and then they give us all this theory of comparative advantage and all of this, but it's not really. Now we have to step back and have our own development economics, you know, and saying why we're not ourselves value adding and localizing. So we really need to, I like the way that it says we need to rethink how we develop. And we are, I mean, what is new? Badi was talking about what we've been at this a long time, but now we are aware. It's no longer a scramble for our minerals. We are aware. So it's really on us. We have all the knowledge. We have this, we are, so it's really up to us, and it's us. I think civil society has to play and I'm glad he mentioned all these cases of corruption and all that. And why isn't Africa talking about these? Well, because you don't have the policy space. Let's be honest. Do we have the policy, the right policy? Do we have but I think Publish What You Pay and other coalition civil society, this is their role. And there are some things that we cannot say. I represent African Union member countries, so I cannot say so and so, but we rely on the civil society to be that voice. And I really think we cannot be forgiven now because we know the reality. We know it. It's not a scramble. We know what's coming. And we know we have the elements. So really, it's up to us, to all of us. I think it's a really shared responsibility among everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Of course, there are questions, and I'm hoping someone will ask that question because we have had the AMV, and to be honest, it's largely been championed by CSOs. And right now we're talking about another strategy being developed, and we're also counting on CSOs. But in the meantime, we're also looking at the fact that there is, you know, a shrinking civic space. Things are getting worse. The more we rely on CSOs, the worse the situation is getting for CSOs to be able to have that influence. So it's quite a tight space, and perhaps you can address that in your final comments. I have usurped my powers and and introduce something as the facilitator. So thank you very much to my panel. That was a lot. I have so many questions, so much feedback, and I'm sure that the audience is also burning. We have online participants, yes? Welcome to our online participants. Yes, just a moment. So we're going to have a few minutes for questions, and I will want to see a show of hands for those that may have questions. I didn't hear the gender issues coming out very clearly from our panel. And I wonder if there's any women who have got questions around that. Why are we not hearing, you know, the gender perspective on the transition? Perfect. I see one lady right there. I think she can kick off the conversation. I see Carol, number 2, and can I have it now? Now it should be completely female dominated, and Fatma. So let's start with the ladies, and then the next round we'll have more questions. Please keep your questions very, very brief. If we want to have a discussion on our thoughts and opinions, they are all around. Buddy will not be around tomorrow, but he will be at the conference next week. But everybody else is around, so we can also meet with them. We've got lots of networking opportunities where we can actually discuss those ideas and bring them back into some of the discussions that we'll have. But for now, keep your questions straight to the point and concise. Thank you.
Donc, je viens du Niger, et le pays des pères de brevets solaires, qui est le professeur Abdul Moumouni. Je vais citer juste par rapport à ce que le professeur Tijani a dit. Il dit le problème, c'est le problème de comment utiliser le solaire pour cuire les aliments au niveau rural. Il a dit en ces termes, il dit la cuisson, les séchages et les forces mécaniques sont donnés aux Africains de futurs comme à l'infini. Il prend l'exemple, il dit la valeur minimum correspondant au mois d'août à Niamey, qui est le mois qui n'est pas trop soleillé même à Niamey, il dit est de 222 kilocalories par mètre et par heure. Et ça, c'est énorme. Il donne l'exemple. Ça correspond à 1 an d'énergie propre dans d'autres villes qui utilisent l'énergie à 100%, plus que 100% que le Niger. Et c'est ce que le professeur a dit. La moitié, plus que la moitié des Nigériens n'ont pas accès à l'énergie. Si on prend un pourcentage, peut-être c'est juste 15%. Et jusqu'à aujourd'hui, le Niger emporte l'énergie des Nigeria. Et il y a eu des initiatives qui ne sont pas d'initiatives cognitives propres. Il y a eu, le professeur, il a créé le Nord-Sol et le Nord-Sol ne fonctionne pas. Maintenant, ma question, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé entre le temps qu'il a créé, qu'il a inventé le brevet et aujourd'hui? Pourquoi les Africains ne se sont pas unis pour vraiment mettre le Nord-Sol au-dessus de tout et avoir aujourd'hui une énergie propre? Parce que la matière première existe, la technologie existe. Donc, qu'est-ce qui n'a pas marché? Et pourquoi aujourd'hui, il a évoqué que même pour la batterie, ça fonctionne à 25% et il faut chercher des éléments ailleurs. Alors que ça a été inventé ici, le solaire existe ici, le Nord-Sol a été créé. C'est quoi? Qu'est-ce qui ne va pas? Pourquoi ces pays africains ne se sont pas réunis et ils continuent de ne pas être réunis autour de ça? Merci beaucoup.
Right, thank you. We'll take the second question from Carol.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel. Carol Kiangura from Kenya. My question is actually to Buddy, and I appreciate that you brought out the issues around the data that's available from the Securities and Exchange Commission on companies that have done horrific things on the continent and our inability to learn from these processes. I mean, I can think quite a bit, for examples, like our judicial systems are challenged, I mean, riddled with corruption and so much more, but there is some effort, you know, like, for example, to do with the East Africa crude oil pipeline. There are some civil society groups that are trying to get some sort of response around social human rights for communities with the East African Court of Justice. So, but again, we are having meddling by the companies on such issues. But I want to know from the EITI end, because these very companies are part of the EITI process, and this EITI is a multi-stakeholder platform. What is being done? Because you are also aware about some of this issues, yeah, whether it's social or human rights that these companies have done and are continuing to perpetuate the same issues, whether we talk about extraction or we talk about moving on to transition and then accessing of our whatever minerals and or whether access to our opportunities that are important for solar. What is the EITI doing or within their standards to ensure that at least we come at these issues combined, because we cannot do it as, I mean, the more the power, the better. So it just cannot be a civil society issue, but you have a good platform at the EITI table to be able to advance some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Fatma?
Thank you so much for the brilliant presentations and comments. My name is Fatima from Mozambique. I always heard that Africa is in a strategic position for this, for that. In the time that the gas was booming, we were in strategic position, but we never go out from the strategic position. So now there is this energy transition. We are always also in a strategic position. My question here is, we have these strategic resources for energy transition. Mozambique, for example, has a graphite that is already being exported by these international or multinationals. We would like to have a factory or industry in Mozambique produce that batteries that will be used for these electric cars. But the negotiations were, let's export raw materials, so they will do that in Australia, in China, US, and so forth. My question is on add value idea that you brought. How can we do that now? Because we already, you named a lot of resources that we have, but all of them are being exploited and exported. All right, so how do we negotiate a different approach that helps us to add value and play different role in this context of energy transition? Because I'm afraid that we will be left behind once again. And I'm very, very much concerned to the kind of dependence relationship that will come from there, because now our countries found alternative sources of financing for their economies, but now they will depend on those who have technology, who has resources, and we will be begging to them to give us money to invest, even to diversify our economy. So I'm really afraid, and I would like to hear from you all, how do we get out from that trap that we were coached? Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for those questions. I think we'll allow the panel to respond, and then we'll come back for another round of questions. So the first question was to Prof. Tijani, and the second was to Badi. The third, I think, between the two ladies, perhaps one of you can address it, or both of you. So Prof, I'll hand it over to you.
Merci. En fait, la question de la dame, pourquoi il n'y a pas un engagement commun dans nos États? Moi, je pose la question simple. Il ne faudrait pas que la transition énergétique soit une question justement étatique. Parmi vous ici, quels sont ceux qui ont du solaire chez lui, chez eux? Qu'est-ce qui a du solaire? Une personne. 2, 3, 4. Non. Aujourd'hui, justement, pour que cette transition énergétique puisse réussir, il faudrait que ce soit une affaire de tous. Une affaire de tous, c'est quoi? Si je prends l'exemple du Sénégal, il faut que nos États disent que, par exemple, au Sénégal, on vous dit que c'est la Sénélec qui est le seul pourvoyeur d'électricité. Vous ne pouvez pas produire de l'électricité. Il faut que cela change. La Sénélec soit prête à acheter l'électricité à un plus haut niveau. Ce que j'avais proposé à l'époque, c'était par rapport à l'essence. Lorsque l'essence diminue, l'État maintient les prix, mais crée un fonds d'impulsion au photovoltaïque. Ça veut dire quoi? Un Sénégalais qui a besoin d'installer du photovoltaïque chez lui, il fait un prêt à l'État et l'État subventionne justement ce prêt. La personne a du photovoltaïque chez lui et quand il a un surplus, Il injecte ça dans le réseau de la Sénélec. Mais le seul problème, c'est que la Sénélec vous dira, moi, est-ce que vous pouvez me garantir, quand j'ai besoin de 10 kilowatts tout de suite, que vous me donnez 10 kilowatts? Si c'est une personne qui est pourvoyeuse d'électricité, ça ne marchera pas. Mais si, imaginez-vous un peu, si tous les Sénégalais se mettaient au solaire et à chaque fois qu'ils ont un surplus, ils injectent le surplus dans le système, ça marchera. Et ça, à ce moment, la transition énergétique sera une affaire de tous. Ce ne sera pas une affaire étatique. Et c'est pareil pour le réchauffement climatique, pour la préservation de l'environnement. Dès lors qu'on maintient que c'est l'affaire de l'État, ça ne marchera jamais. Et c'est pareil pour le solaire. Si l'État du Sénégal disait, moi ou n'importe quel État, moi, voilà ce que je veux faire, on peut le faire. Mais il faudrait que nos États créent ce qu'on appelle le marché carbone. Quels sont les États ici en Afrique qui ont un marché carbone? Il n'y en a pas. Il faut créer le marché carbone. Parce que le fait que vous utilisez de l'énergie solaire, vous avez droit à ce qu'on vous achète votre crédit carbone. Parce que les Européens et les Américains, le financement qu'ils font pour la transition énergétique, mais normalement, quand on va dans le mécanisme de développement propre, on doit recevoir de l'argent par rapport à cela. Et justement, il faut que les États, justement, mettent l'accent là-dessus pour que les populations puissent bénéficier justement de ce crédit carbone, de ce marché carbone qu'on pourra mettre en place. Voilà.
Thank you for the question. I will comment quickly, and if you give me time, I can say a few words about the second question. Yes, the EITI is multi-stakeholder. We have companies, government, and civil society. Many of you, some of you actually on our board are here. We are not an enforcement agency. We are not a court. We promote transparency and good governance through data and dialogue. So sometimes there are some misplaced expectations about what we can do. The reason why I drew the attention to these examples of cases of corruption, which involve those companies, and it's involved two sides. Every act of corruption, at least there are two actors involved. And I highlighted the enforcement mechanism against one side. I have yet to see any government official in any of those cases in Africa who have been investigated or anything, even any local court taking this matter in any way. So that is the challenge. So what is the EITI doing about this? The updated standard, something that was very high priority for us, was to mainstream transparency across every aspect of the disclosures, the mainstream anti-corruption measures and energy transition measures and gender across all this, the value chain. So what it meant was that as we roll out that standard, hopefully it will be much more useful for you as an advocacy tool in any of those three pillars and the domestic resource mobilization, if that is the main priority in that sense. So it is a tool, a governance tool. It's an advocacy tool for you, but we are not the enforcer. So the enforcement is best done by competent institutions, ideally at national level. The second point here, and I fully agree with you, it's the endless. There is a point about somebody used to, a former classmate of mine used to say that Brazil is always the country of the future, and Africa is the country, is the strategic continent for everyone. And it is true, we always have that mirage, and somehow we tend not to realize it. What I do want to point out are a few things for you to consider here is we need to remember that the size matter here. There are rule makers and rule takers, especially in market environments. The smaller you are, the more likely you are a rule taker. So sometimes we confuse our own roles. We happen to be based in Norway. You will be surprised to see that Norwegian government, which is certainly richer than any African government, but they tend to copy, they are not member of the European Union. They tend to adopt a lot of European regulations, not by force, but just because somebody has already invested research, design, consultations, etc. We here in Africa, I agree with you, we need to look at internally, but we also need to remember the limit of our powers, that the capital that is needed to develop these resources is coming from abroad. And there's only so much we can dictate in those terms. So it's important to know where is the limit. So where is it the time that for you to defer to other rules, and where is the time that you are to set the rules?
Thank you, Buddy. Ladies, any takers for the last question? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a feeling that we are always strategic, but it doesn't, but we have to be evidence-based also. Since the Africa Mining Vision 2009, in 47 countries, there are some reforms on their policies. I don't know if you can attribute directly to the AMV, but you know, there is a realization. And before they used to have very basic mining codes. And now most countries like the 47, and I think it's NRGI did a study on that, have reformed their policies. And the principles of the Africa Mining Vision are there in one way or the other. Particularly in Mozambique, and I know Mozambique because I've worked there. And we were actually, my task was to domesticate the Africa Mining Vision in the implementation plan of the mineral policy in Mozambique. And at that time, that was 2016, so that was 7 years ago. Graphite was not in the picture yet, but we really was pushing for government to have the strategic coherence between the mining policy, industrial policy, environment, gender, again, and all of these coherence. And it's not easy. I mean, we think about it when we talk about strategy, but when you go to the field and you go to the countries to have this coherence, because all of them, they work in silos, you really need to sit down together. I remember, and I know Fatima, you were also part of it sometimes, we had to sit down with the ministries and tell them this has to merge and these are the objectives, the targets, etc. It's a whole, this I'm talking about one country. So you mentioned graphite and how graphite is now sent raw, and we are also seeing that in dismay. And we know that, you know, which are the companies doing that and all that. But I mean, we have to understand one thing: not every country needs to have these precursor plants. I mean, DRC has, if DRC and Zambia have it, we can use the African Continental Free Trade Area to have these kinds of connections. They need the graphite. Graphite is in Mozambique, Madagascar, Tanzania, not necessarily in DRC, not at production level. So they need to source it from somewhere. So this kind of, you know, this kind of coalitions, because as Buddy was saying, markets matter. If we are fragmented, it's a small country, Mozambique, you cannot make the leverage. So we really need to come. SADC is one opportunity, and SADC has actually is one of the most advanced regional economic communities when it comes to industrialization strategy. And they do have those policies in place. Talking about policies, they do have them, but they have this regional industrialization framework, and this is really the idea. And for SADC, actually, we went back to, there is a SADC regional mining vision. Exactly, it's domesticating it at the regional level for SADC. So these are the issues that we have. But as I'm saying, it's a shared responsibility. We at the apex, we can only do strategic policy. We try to implement. We do implement. We do regional. We were going directly to countries before, but as you were saying, we learned the lessons. It has to be community economies of scale. We can't just go to one country because it doesn't have the impact, but we go to region. And that's why we really like, for this graphite especially, and I'm pleading here, that, you know, there needs to be collaboration with to have that kind of impact. Otherwise, one country alone, Mozambique on its own, we can't. And since you are there, civil society, and I know that I'm tying it to the question of the tightening space for civil society, it's regrettable because I really think that, you know, they are the ones who can say things more than we can, and they can make advance when we can't, because we can set the strategies. And you're right, AMV was really driven by civil society, local indigenous ones, and also like Publish What You Pay. So we really look into you to really drive this, because it's a shared responsibility. At our level, AMDC, we are 4 people, just to remind you, but we try to leverage on all these partnerships and all these, and we need to create this kind of momentum and movement so that it comes to the countries as well. Thank you.
Just want to add very quickly, just a couple of statements. Everything everyone said, obviously, I agree. And just want to emphasize, obviously, it's important to have that block of negotiating power and that comparative advantage. There's an example with Botswana in terms of the negotiation with the Bears to ensure value addition, but that's because they had established that comparative advantage, and that's something that a block like this could leverage. NRGI actually has a Just Energy Transition Partnership model as well that can enable those potential blocks to negotiate win-win strategies with those who potentially fund as well. So those are things that I just wanted us to sort of keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take another round of questions, and there's one that Buddy has specifically intervened for. I don't think I saw her. Okay. I didn't have any questions from here. So I'll take one from here, one from the gents. Yeah, as many as I can. I would also invite all our participants online to please submit your questions. We are looking forward to your questions. If you can type them in, and we'll have them read out and responded to by the panelists. So I'll take one question here. Yeah, next to Monday.
Ma question s'adresse à Dr Keitao. C'est Georges Paga. Effectivement, on a beaucoup épilogué, on a écouté les discours, les différents débats, les interventions, les contributions. Mais il est fondamental que nous puissions également connaître au niveau de l'Union africaine, parce que tout ce processus lié à la politique globale de transition énergétique doit être implémenté au niveau continental par l'Union africaine. Le maître d'œuvre, en fait, de cette vision, de cette perspective, de ces nouveaux défis devrait être l'Union africaine. Je voudrais savoir concrètement, docteur, quels sont les mécanismes pour le financement, parce qu'il y a une question, une problématique fondamentale, c'est le financement de tout ce changement, de ces nouveaux paradigmes. Comment cela va être conçu? Quels sont les instruments qui sont prévus au niveau continental par l'Union africaine pour parvenir à financer toute cette transformation, toutes ces infrastructures qui vont être mises en place au niveau continental? Voilà un peu la substance de ma question.
I'll take another question in the back there. Sir, in the back with the blue headphones. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel Kuyoli. First is just a comment on Badi's response on the corruption issue. For those who have followed the ITI for a while, you know that there were times where even subnational reporting was not talked about, and even issues of environmental and social reporting was never mentioned at the EITI. We have that in the standard today because Publish What You Pay members pushed at the country level, and some even dared and published their own reports. So I want to encourage Publish What You Pay members that some of these issues that are very germane at the country level should go ahead and push it and get it published at the country level. Hopefully, EITI at the international level will turn around one day. My main comment is about the conversation around the transition minerals, and I feel that for African civil society, it's important, as Prof said, that we have a very holistic look at it. Because the minerals we are talking about, for a lot of countries, it's actually not a shift from anything. It's a shift from fossils to more extraction in the minerals. And actually, for the minerals, if you look at it from the land perspective, for a lot of countries, it's actually cutting down natural solutions to the climate problem. And I'm talking about destroying forests and other kinds of things like that to be able to dig up those minerals we are talking about. So the issue about communities and the role of communities is very, very important. So my suggestion will be that in the next iteration of the EITI, it's important to use this as an opportunity to change the EITI process itself and the reporting mechanism to center these issues. And I think it's a survival mechanism for the EITI itself. Going forward, that we have issues that are important to the communities in which each one of us come from are at the center of this energy transition conversation. Otherwise, what makes us think that if we have been producing minerals for over 100 years, as has been said by the panel, and nothing has changed, what makes us think that this next phase, there's going to be anything significant benefit for Africa? By the way, the minerals are already being produced. So it's not, the train has already left for a lot of countries.
Thank you very much. I'll take one question here. Yes, sir, you may stand. Please introduce yourselves before you speak, your name and where you're
Thank you so much. I'm Comrade Taiwo Otitolaye, National Coordinator, Publish What to Pay Nigeria. Well, I will go straight to questions since I will obey the rule that comments is not for this section. Yeah, my worries is how to go about the just clean energy transition. We have passed through some cycles with mere sloganeering. Now we can say just clean energy transition, just clean energy transition, like sing song. How can we, because just clean energy transition is situated in what I would call governance structure. Within Africa, although different countries have their own peculiar environment. How do we avoid the pitfall of corporate capture, like in the oil, gas? It's even happening in the mining already, because we must devise a way. How do we avoid the past pitfall of corporate capture? Because that is it, connivance between governments, operators, and at times selected community leaders. So thank you. I'll rest my question here.
Thank you, Comrade. I'll take one question at the very back there from this row. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm David Ramohanwe from South Africa, a member of the Publish What to Pay Steering Committee. My question, simple. We've been talking about discussions at the highest level. And what about the issue of public participation from the grassroots level? Because public participation is very important to avoid issue of litigation. We cannot just have discussions only at the highest level, whereby government is involved, mining companies are involved, etc. People from the grassroots must also air their views. That is one question. The second question is that we are having two institutions that are very important. One, the Pan-African Parliament. Two, the African Union. What is their position in as far as the issue of just transition of energy is concerned? Lastly, my question is that, like the AMP, do we have a guiding document or a policy or legislation that says, this is our direction as Africa. This is how we're supposed to move as Africa in ensuring that we deal with the issue of just energy transition. We don't have a position as Africa. Countries are dealing with issues of just energy transition individually, so a country basis. But we need to have a position as Africa to say, what is it that you must do? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade. Madam in the front.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup. J'ai juste... Oui, moi, j'ai juste une question. Quand on parle de transition juste et équitable, on prend en compte ou bien on fait référence à la prise en compte des besoins spécifiques des femmes et des jeunes. Et si on prend le cadre du changement climatique, nous savons que ce sont les femmes qui subissent aujourd'hui les impacts négatifs du changement climatique. Et en même temps, c'est les femmes qui utilisent aujourd'hui les ressources naturelles pour prendre en compte leurs besoins, c'est-à-dire en termes d'énergie, pour l'eau, l'approvisionnement en eau, etc. Aujourd'hui, j'ai une question par rapport à l'Union africaine. Est-ce qu'il existe aujourd'hui un plan ou bien des stratégies qui sont mises en place pour accompagner les femmes au niveau communautaire ou bien de manière générale à ce que ces femmes puissent avoir les moyens nécessaires pour une transition équitable qui prendra en compte leurs besoins? Parce que nous savons que c'est l'Afrique qui pollue moins, mais c'est l'Afrique également qui subit aujourd'hui les changements climatiques. Donc, et puis, plus tard, nous allons vers la transition énergétique, mais quelles sont aujourd'hui les dispositions, les stratégies qui sont mises en place pour permettre à ces femmes, à ces jeunes d'accéder à l'énergie équitable et juste pour un changement climatique, pour une transition énergétique? Merci beaucoup.
Right. I'll take one more question here, Madam in the middle row. Behind you.
Merci. Je suis Fatoumata Kanté, je viens de la Guinée. Ma question s'adresse au professeur Tidjani, qui a bien planté le décor par rapport aux défis environnementaux qui nous assaillent. Mais ma question, je m'intéresse plutôt à la négociation, la question de la négociation qu'il a touché dans son intervention. Il disait ceci, ne laissez pas les dirigeants y aller tout seuls. Et aujourd'hui, on sent que l'Afrique est particulièrement ou presque absente dans les négociations. Concrètement, qu'est-ce que vous proposez pour que cette question soit prise en compte pour que ces chercheurs, la société civile, parce que tout le monde est unanime du rôle que peut jouer la société civile, vous l'avez tous réitéré dans vos interventions. Comment faire aujourd'hui pour faire participer davantage la société civile, les autres entités dans les pools de négociateurs? Également, l'autre phase de la question s'adresse à l'Union africaine. Quelle partition il pourrait jouer pour faire évoluer ce processus? Merci.
Thank you so much to the audience for the questions. Do we have any questions from our online? Right. So we've got quite a long list of questions. So what I'll do is we'll just go from the end there with you. Yeah. If you can respond to your questions and then you pass it on. I think we have about 10 minutes left. So if we can try to fit in our responses within the time that we have.
Okay. Thank you everyone for those questions. And it appeared that there was a thread going through most of the questions, which is around just energy transition. What's interesting about the fact that everyone is using that term, just energy transition, is that it means different things to different people. And we could all think that we're saying the same thing, but potentially not. Unpacking that, I think again, without going into a whole presentation, because we have a session tomorrow that's actually going to do looking at that, just basically the Energize is running. So maybe come to that if you want to have more of a conversation around that. But in terms of making sure that the grassroots are involved in the solution, I think civil society has a role to play in that. In your modeling, I think it's your responsibility to make sure they're getting the insights and the perspectives of those who are on the ground. And even letting them know that energy transition, first of all, exists, because in our engagements, there's a huge lack of awareness in terms of what this term of energy transition even means for those who are in the grassroots and the communities. They don't know what's going on. So that's the sort of first space. And then ensuring capacity building as well for them to be able to understand how to engage when they understand what this term means, depending on how it's defined and what are the core issues that matter to them. It can be environmental justice, it can be economic stability, it can be social inclusion. It's then giving them the tools in terms of how do they then engage with the government, at what level, what opportunities are there around that. You know, there are a lot of people that don't understand how to speak, again, English potentially, so in their local languages as well, how can they understand what this means? In Nigeria, you have a transition that envisions clean cooking. So women in communities now transitioning, but then how can they get access to affordable energy? How can they understand what this means? How can they transition their own systems? I remember we had the conversation around just energy transition and people were saying that you want me to transition, but when I make bread, it's sweeter when I use firewood, you know, so how do you start to engage that kind of conversation? You know, so it's unpacking all of those things. And I think civil society has a huge role to play in terms of, again, being sensitive to the issues that people are actually facing. The reality of it is all well and good to talk about it intelligently or intellectually at this high level, but then having to understand the A's and B's, how it gets from using particular energy sources and then they're maybe to use it in their own homes and how it translates to their own livelihoods, to making their houses run, to making their lives run. So I think that's one important aspect of this that has to be put in place. And that same approach, I think, can be adapted for women and the youth as well, in terms of what the opportunities are as well, so that they can be less potentially combative when it comes to any transition. Because I think a lot of the time as well, there's a lot of conversation in terms of what the negative impacts are, but not in terms of what the positive impacts are as well, and how people can engage those opportunities at an early enough stage, as opposed to too late in the game, when, again, the car has already left the driveway, the train has already left the station, but it's important that we get on board and start to move properly and understand where our rights are, can engage with this to make sure that we're able to get the most advantage out of this. I'll stop there for now.
Prof, there were a couple of questions addressed to you. I think there was one specifically looking at how to go about it. Sorry? The international, yes,
Comment
yes.
impliquer la société civile? Moi, je pense que, j'en discutais hier avec un collègue à vous, je pense que la société civile peut accompagner les populations dans l'éveil des consciences. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, on se rend compte que les populations sont laissées à elles-mêmes. Tout à l'heure, l'exemple que j'ai pris en disant que le combat contre, je dirais, la mutation vers la transition énergétique, ça ne doit pas être uniquement climatique, etc. Et c'est là où vous devez accompagner les populations, même les études d'impact environnemental. Quand on fait une étude d'impact environnemental, les populations ne sont pas bien outillées justement pour suivre le projet. Et c'est là où vous devez mettre l'accent. Mais cet accent passe par quoi? Sensibilisation, conscientisation, à tous les niveaux. Parce qu'on se rend compte, bon, moi je travaille beaucoup dans l'environnement, la sensibilisation des grandes personnes, ça ne marche pas. Aujourd'hui, il faut aller vers une sensibilisation depuis le bas âge. C'est pourquoi, à l'époque, j'avais lancé un magazine, je m'adressais aux grandes personnes. Là, je suis en train de lancer une bande dessinée pour m'adresser justement aux enfants, pour que ces enfants puissent grandir avec une conscience énergétique. Et cette transition énergétique, c'est vrai qu'on a parlé de beaucoup, mais ça touche tout. Ça touche les entreprises qui aujourd'hui doivent acheter de nouveaux équipements. Ça touche aujourd'hui le bâtiment, etc. Donc, je pense que c'est là où vous avez un rôle à jouer par rapport aux populations, l'accompagnement des populations, l'éveil de conscience, la conscientisation. Maintenant, par rapport à la dame, l'autonomisation des femmes, par rapport à la transition écologique, c'est difficile parce que les femmes, elles produisent, elles ont besoin peut-être éventuellement d'énergie pour transformer. Leur autonomisation, elle est très facile quand on parle d'environnement, mais quand on parle d'énergie, c'est compliqué parce que si on ne met pas en place un mécanisme de transformation des produits, parler d'énergie à ces bonnes femmes qui sont dans les villages reculés, ça ne sert pas aujourd'hui à grand-chose. Vous voyez? Donc, je pense que transition énergétique, environnement, réchauffement climatique, ça va de pair. Et ça, aujourd'hui, on ne peut pas dissocier ces deux événements. Voilà, merci.
Merci. Thank you very much. I will try to group some of the questions. So what are we doing at the African Union level for the positioning on energy transition? It's a very difficult question. As I said, I mentioned the Green Recovery Action Plan 2021-2027. That's an African Union strategy. But as I was mentioning the Mozambique case, that you have to coordinate between the Ministry of Mines, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Gender, Environment, Transport even. At the African Union level, minerals sits under the Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals department. We have other departments dealing with infrastructure and energy, and we have another one dealing with agriculture, renewable energy, and the blue economy. So environment and the blue economy. So we have like 3 different departments that we are trying to get one strategy because it involves all of us. But the lead on this one, on the energy transition, is the infrastructure and energy side. But of course, they are consulting us. We are very much in consultation because we have to have a position for the COP28 coming up in Dubai. And so we are working on it. We, from the mineral side, we're seeing it as a strategic input because we have the minerals. They're seeing, and some of the issues that you mentioned, especially carbon markets was mentioned. One of the financing schemes is the carbon markets, actually. How to leverage our own, like Congo has this big, it's the lung of Africa. They have this, and other countries also have that. So how do we leverage the carbon markets to make sure? And that's also something that, it's coming from outside, and it's not really, when you think about it and when you see it right now, it's not perfect at all. There's so many issues with integrity and all that. But this is somewhere also we can legitimately, instead of just asking for aid, this is legitimately how to, carbon markets are legitimately a financing schemes that we can look into from the outside. And again, we have to look at new paradigms, new development way of doing. So at the APEX level, at the AU level, like I said, we have our own African Green Mineral Strategy, but a whole coherent energy transition, not strategy, but at least a plan is emerging. And when you talk about, somebody was talking about negotiations, and there are African negotiators, even for the COP28, and civil society plays a big role in that. Of course, they consult and everything, but there are people who are specifically there to negotiate on behalf of African interests to the COP27. That's what they, to the COPs in general. That's why they came up with the COP27. That's why this loss and damage fund, which never, it's just a fund that was created with no money. It's interesting. But that's how, they finally made some strides. That's when also they came up with this gas transition side. So we are still for the COP28. It's coming up quickly, actually. It's in November. We're trying to have, it's not as, as you can imagine, 55 African countries having one position is very difficult. But there are, even within the African constituency, there are ups and downs because there are regions who are good. There are some who are advocating for hydrogen. There are some who are doing a lot of, so it's we're trying to get an African position, but sometimes it could be regional, sometimes it could be just to let you know that we are thinking about it, the costs and emissions, and we're thinking about the right to development as well. But to come up with one position, it takes a lot of negotiations, and we have experts that are there looking at it from holistically. I like the intervention about African parliaments, Pan-African Parliament. That's a whole other issue, but it's a genuine question to ask where we are with that. And the African Union, I think I answered that. I liked the way that the person from was saying that we are still extracting, we are still in the extracting side. We are using land, we are deforesting. That means more and more, but are we doing it smartly? I mean, we have ways of doing it that are more efficient, more reducing, they call them smart mining, climate smart mining, less use of water, using even the products that you use. There are ways of doing it that are decarbonizing the process of minerals. So we are adhering to that. We have a project actually with the Germans that just to do that. And another very important aspect before I close, why is we not extract? We need our own investors, basically African investors. Why the capital intensiveness? Why external companies come is because African countries we can't afford because it's very capital. So how are we leveraging? We have a program called the African Minerals, Energy and Resources Classification. It classifies minerals in a way that you can peg them to the stock exchanges, so that you can actually get some value for. So if we create our own African investors, then it stays. So I think that's where we should go instead of again looking for outside for financing. Let's do it our own. So let's empower our African investors, and to do that they need the capital, and we need to find a way to make sure that they get that capital. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All many excellent comments, and I have certainly learned a lot here. So just to the question specifically addressed to me about local subnational reporting and so on. I have good news for you. That does not need to wait for the next iteration of the standard. That is still a reality today. So we, in fact, in March, we were in Argentina. So if you look at EITI implementation in Argentina, it is entirely at subnational level. It's a provincial state that implement the EITI. And while we were there, 4 of them signed up to implement the EITI. And that is just, I'm not recommending that everywhere. It's just happened to be that that's the kind of legal structure they have. I'm highlighting it for you to say that the EITI is best shaped by your advocacy. And I will give one concrete example. I don't know if Jean-Claude Katende is in the room here, but it's from the DRC. I remember very vividly in 2013, we were in a very tense meeting with government officials in the DRC, with civil society and so on, related to one contract called SICOMIN. And Jean-Claude Katende was so adamant, focused on one, that this contract must be published. At that time, that was not a requirement in our standard, but Jean-Claude made it a requirement in the DRC. So it had to be disclosed. But that was very tense negotiations. And one of the things that came out of it is, some of you may be reading the news. You may have seen the president of the DRC just coming back from China, renegotiating that exact same contract. It took 10 years for everyone to catch up to where Jean-Claude was back in 2013. When he demanded that contract to be published, when it came out, it turned out that the annexes were in Chinese. And then we asked ourselves, how many people in the government of the DRC spoke Chinese to review that contract in the first place? So who reviewed the contract if we could not find the technical terms of a $6 billion contract? We couldn't find the details in any French or English document. So it's just to give you an example of a power of advocacy that you have at individual level. one person focusing on one issue and staying there. And it's not about being belligerent or adversarial and so on. So many of you do that so astutely in so many environments that we know is very challenging, because civic space is a challenge in many of these countries. But your effort in challenging those authorities at that level and making these issues very concrete and demanding one project, one issue, one law, one regulations, and forcing everyone to focus their mind and get it right is essential as we go forward. So we're very much looking forward to discussing further next week. We have really interesting comments and questions here. Many of these questions that have been raised here, you will hopefully have the opportunity to deepen this conversation at the global conference next week as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my amazing panel. A round of applause. Thank you. So we've had, I think, a very good start to what is going to be a long 2 days of conversation. But I think that by the time we're leaving this place, we'll definitely have a better perspective on what the opportunities are and also the risks. I really appreciated the understanding that when we talk about villagers, the local community, typically they are a villager who probably has no level of education, and their understanding of an energy transition is so far beyond what we even conceive it to be. And that is one of the key barriers that we'll have in trying to translate that to what it means to local communities, if at all the transition is going to be meaningful to them as well. And of course, the issue of financing comes out very strongly. And it's not just international financing, but we're also looking at how we can raise domestic financing. And I think that's probably one challenge that we'll have to take on as CSOs, because this is where issues of transparency and accountability come on. Holding companies accountable, holding governments accountable, and even just giving communities the capacity to hold these different stakeholders accountable, because we really can't do it on our own as CSOs. But indeed, as we leave this conversation, I take home that we are watchdogs as CSOs, and we are there to really be that watchdog that reminds governments that they have a role to play in the transition. A lot of governments in Africa are not even talking about this. In Malawi, we've done some research as SEPA, and we found that when it comes to energy, Malawi is not even talking about a transition at all. We're simply looking at what the opportunities are for us right now. And I think that's an experience in a lot of governments. We've got bigger fish to fry, they would say. And so it creates a barrier, but also perhaps an opportunity for us to translate this to our governments. But we're also mediators between governments, international stakeholders, and the local communities. We are perhaps the closest to these local communities, and we perhaps are the ones that they trust even more than they'll trust our governments. So for us, I think we have a very important role in taking this discussion from this level back to our communities and helping them to participate more meaningfully, but also to contribute within our national context and our local context to what an energy transition would mean to them. And I've got this from our entire conversation, and I'm sure there's a lot more that we could unpack, but we will be looking into that in the next few days. So once again, I'd like to thank my esteemed panel. A round of applause, please. And thank you to the audience for your questions and your comments. Let's take advantage of the opportunities for networking that we'll have through the next few days to engage with our panelists and to bring out more of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Thank you. Merci beaucoup à Gloria et merci beaucoup à vous tous et à toutes pour la participation active. Nous savons que vous avez beaucoup de questions et commentaires. Nous encourageons pour le panel de cet après-midi et pour les autres jours, les questions écrites ou les commentaires écrits. Si on ne peut pas donner la parole à tout le monde, mais vous pouvez écrire sur les notes des questions que vous avez, on pourra les soumettre aux panélistes. Ce matin, il a été question beaucoup plus de comprendre ce que signifie la transition énergétique pour nous, notamment en Afrique, et pour notre mouvement de transparence, que ce soit Oubliez ce que vous payez, même aussi de l'ITE, l'Initiative pour la transparence dans les industries extractives. Cet après-midi, on va aller beaucoup plus en détail parce que l'Afrique est riche en ressources naturels, mais aussi des minéraux qu'on appelle minéraux importants, minéraux critiques, minéraux de transition. Pour aller vers la transition énergétique, pour aller vers les énergies propres, on a besoin de ces minéraux qu'on appelle minéraux de transition. Il sera question cet après-midi de parler de ces minéraux de transition, mais particulièrement de discuter de cette stratégie que Public Ce que vous payez propose à l'ensemble des acteurs. On présentera une carte avec un code QR. Vous allez juste scanner sur le code QR avec votre téléphone. Vous pourrez avoir toutes les informations détaillées par rapport à cette stratégie ou ce plan de campagne de plaidoyer. Et si vous voulez y adhérer, vous remplissez juste votre nom, votre adresse email et quelques détails et on vous met dans la liste de personnes qui recevront les informations liées à l'évolution de cette campagne. Ceci dit, nous allons prendre la pause pour 1 heure de temps. 1 heure tout simplement parce que nous voulons au moins que nous puissions finir à temps et permettre à tous ceux qui ont fait un voyage long de se reposer. C'était très long et hier, les autres sont arrivés un peu tard. Alors, on va recevoir des tickets pour le déjeuner, tout le monde. Vous verrez, l'équipe d'appui vous donnera au couloir des tickets d'accès au restaurant pour le déjeuner. Pour les dîners de ce soir, pour tous les membres, vous serez remboursés tout à l'heure dans l'après-midi, tous les frais de dîner et vous pourrez aller manger dehors si vous voulez. Si vous voulez manger dans l'hôtel, vous devrez payer pour manger dans l'hôtel. Parce qu'on n'a pas couvert les dîners pour aujourd'hui et pour demain, on va vous rembourser les dîners. C'est bon? Excellent. Donc, dans l'après-midi, à la pause, vous prendrez contact ou à la fin de la journée, vous prendrez contact avec le service qui est chargé de rembourser ces frais de dîner et tous les autres frais, y compris. Pour les questions de santé, si quelqu'un a des soucis de santé, je vous ai dit, nous avons 2 médecins sur place qui sont en charge de vous accompagner par rapport à cela. N'hésitez pas, ils sont dans l'autre côté dans la salle. Et enfin, bon appétit, 1 heure de temps, il est 13h24 à ma montre, on revient à 14h24. C'est bon? Merci beaucoup.
Thank you and enjoy your lunch.